as you might have all realized, it's an out-of-hours session. And this is a personal project of mine called Adrenaline Memories. And why am I here on a Sunday afternoon when outside is sunny and beautiful? Well, I have to thank all my patrons who support me at the moment and keep me motivated and continue to help me evolve and get better in terms of the teaching that I deliver. And through their support, I'm able to support these two great charities. And this is that whole idea about what drives me and what keeps me motivated. And, you know, in the center of that, I think, you know, I want you guys also to sort of understand what motivates you and what drives you, what helps you make those sacrifices that you are making at the moment to ultimately pass this exam. And so with these, let me just give a plug out to these two. So I've got the Asylum Seeker Resource Center, who support and empower those who are less fortunate, because I think that I have a lot to be thankful for, especially during the last, over the last year. You know, I've been so fortunate in terms of my circumstances, and they do really good work here. And also, you know, the proceeds will also go to the ANSCA Research Foundation, which supports medical research and education, saving lives, helping people to reclaim their health, and aiming to make life as pain-free as possible, both physically and mentally. Although I'm sure all of you might have something to say about that with the preparation for this primary exam. But I will do my best to make sure that it is as pain-free as possible. Now, the framework that I often do with these sessions is really to aim to stimulate your thought processes and release adrenaline, get you excited, to help facilitate attention to detail and assist your brain in creating long-term memory. And you can watch all the previous episodes up on YouTube. They're all up available for free, okay? Because look, as much as I am appreciative of all the support financially, I am also sensitive to the issues that you are training anaesthetists. And the cost that's there is not insignificant. And I do believe that education should be made freely available. So everything that I do in terms of that's important will be made freely available on YouTube. Okay, so if you don't decide to join Patreon, you don't have to. It will be up on YouTube for free. The way that we're going to run the session is the way that I normally do my sessions sort of the last couple of weeks. And it's going to be a little bit different to the ones that, or the way that we've done it in the last 2 days on Thursday and Friday. We're going to review the examiner's report in detail. And then I'm going to show you which literature I have gotten my concepts from. I'll present those key concepts. We'll answer any questions then. So it's going to be a little bit different in terms of we're going to leave the questions to the end after I present those concepts, and then we can go through them. And then following from that, I'm going to show you a structure that I've created to the answer. And we are all, including myself, going to write an answer to time. In the primary exam course on Thursday, Friday, these are the topics that we've covered. So we've covered the control of breathing, and also the importance of respiratory physiology. And then we've covered the mechanics of breathing, including the muscles of respiration, work of breathing, compliance, resistance, hysteresis, also called the time dependence of pulmonary elastic behavior. This is what we're going to try to cover, okay? And I think that with the way that I think that you get most value out of this, which is doing it in this kind of manner, the trade-off is that it's going to take longer for us to complete all these topics. So these topics will probably be done over the next couple of weeks. Okay, and I will sort of send out emails if you want to join these open sessions to cover these topics. All right. So the first topic that we're going to cover from this is fast versus slow alveoli. And this is a 2008 question 13, which is explain the concept of time constants and relate these to fast and slow alveoli. This is the examiner's report. So what I do is I highlight the greens to just tell you what's important, and the red just says what to avoid. So the answer should include an objective, mathematically based definition of a time constant. In relation to lung units, the time constant is often defined as the product of compliance and resistance. Some factors that influence time constants, physiological and pathological causes of alterations in compliance and resistance should also be listed. The effects of heterogeneity in time constants, static versus dynamic compliance, and respiratory rate should also be discussed. And this word heterogeneity, this is one that's going to come up a lot of times when we talk about time constants. Additional marks were awarded for ways of measuring the effects of heterogeneity of time constants, the Kapnogram and the peak versus plateau pressures. Many candidates spent a lot of time explaining various other formulas pertaining to compliance, surfactant, and alveolar collapse that were not directly related to the question. Many candidates thought that increased compliance causes fast time constants. Now, the key thing with this last one, we get the additional marks. So we know that the Kapnogram, I'm going to show you how the Kapnogram can be used to measure the effects of heterogeneity and the peak versus plateau pressures. Remember that we tie these peak and versus plateau pressures with static and with, peak versus is dynamic and plateau is static. So that's the relationship with those concepts. And we're going to try to tie in these peak versus plateau with the dynamic versus static compliance concepts. This is a summary of the examiner's report. So what I think you need to get a pass or good pass is that you need to have a definition of the time constant, so a mathematical definition followed by definition related to lung units. You need to discuss the factors affecting time constants, which can be both physiological and pathological. And I know it sounds difficult, but just have a think about this. We're just talking about compliance and resistance. In other words, if you think about that, we are just talking about work of breathing, okay? And I'll give you some time to sort of think about that in terms of, compliance and resistance. The effect of heterogeneity of time constants, which can be related to the static versus dynamic compliance curves and respiratory rate. Extra marks include the quantification of the heterogeneity of time constants, which include the Kapnogram and peak versus plateau pressures. And you do not want to discuss in detail compliance, surfactant, and alveolar collapse. This is the literature that I've used for this answer. So primarily NUNS, Chapter 7, Distribution of Pulmonary Ventilation and Perfusion, Chapter 9 on carbon dioxide, and Appendix E, the mathematical functions related to respiratory physiology. So the definition of a time constant, the mathematical definition is the time required to reach completion if the initial rate of change were maintained in a first order system. What do I mean by that? So look at the graph that I have here. What it means is that if you sort of draw a tangent line to the initial rate of change. So from here, okay, this is the time it would take to complete if the initial rate of change were maintained in a first order system. And note that in a first order system, the rate of change changes in proportion to the volume at a given time. In other words, as the volume decreases, you will see the rate of change decreases. Okay, so this is another one here. You can say this is, oops, sorry, got my ruler here. And then you've got another one coming across from here like that. Okay. So that one time constant equals 63% completion, or 1 minus Euler's number to the power of -1. And what you find is that once you go above 2 to 3 time constants, you are heading to near completion. This is similar to half-lives, and I'll describe the relationship to half-lives. So half-lives, we talk about 3 to 5 half-lives for it to get completion. Whereas for a time constant, it's more than 2 to 3 time constants to get completion. And there is a relationship between time constant and half-life. And this is the question here. What is the relationship between time constant, rate constant, and half-life? This is the exponential decay function. The one that I've described here is that the initial volume is multiplied by Euler's number to the power of minus k times t, where k is your elimination rate constant. Now, tau is your time constant, and t half equals half-life. The time constant equals 1 divided by your elimination rate constant. The reason for that is that what you want this to equal is, for one time constant, you want this to equal 1. So that one time constant is the initial volume multiplied by Euler's number minus 1. And to do that, okay, the time needs to be 1 over k. All right. And then if you have two time constants equals 2 over k. Now, we know that the relationship is this, so time constant equals 1 divided by your elimination rate constant. We also know that half-life equals 0.693, and 0.693 is the natural log of 2, which is related to your half-life, divided by your elimination rate constant. And these are the different variations that you will see in textbooks, which is why you get confused. Because a lot of times, a lot of candidates will confuse a time constant for an elimination rate constant. But you can see that it's different. A half-life equals 0.693 multiplied by your time constant. And then you'll see this other derivation where a time constant equals 1.44 times your half-life. And that's where you get that idea where you know that the time to completion is 3 to 5 half-lives. And so when you think about a time constant, the time to completion is 1.44 less of that, which is more than 2 to 3 time constants. Now, this is from episode 5, and it's available on the YouTube channel. But in pharmacokinetics, when we talk about first order kinetics, the rate of change is your first rate order constant multiplied by the concentration. And K here is your, what we call the proportionality constant that describes the rate of elimination to the drug concentration. Let's look at it in terms of respiratory physiology. So in respiratory physiology for first order kinetics, the rate of change equals your first order rate constant multiplied by your volume. Okay. And so K here is your proportionality constant that describes the rate of expiration or inspiration to the current volume of the lung. And this is where these two formulas come from. So this is for expiration and this is for inspiration. And these are your rate constants. And so knowing that your time constant is 1/K. You don't need to know the derivation of this, but it is important you appreciate where it comes from, because the next point is, how do we go from this exponential decay function where time constant equals 1/K to saying that a time constant equals compliance times resistance? This is how. You don't need to know this, but again, appreciate where it comes from. So for expiration, flow equals pressure divided by resistance. And we also know that compliance equals the change in volume for a given change in pressure. And what you do is that you put those two equations together to get this. You rearrange the formula, you integrate it, and then after you integrate it, you take the antilogs of both sides to get this formula here, where the volume at a given time equals your initial volume times Euler's number to the power of minus t, which is time, divided by compliance times resistance. And so the rate constant, which is K, equals 1/compliance times resistance. And therefore your time constant equals compliance times resistance. This is the mathematical derivation of where a time constant for a lung unit comes from. Again, you don't need to know how this is all sort of worked out. But I think what is important is that you know where it is derived from. And it is derived from these two formulas, knowing that flow equals pressure divided by resistance. And then secondly, that compliance equals volume divided by pressure. Now, for alveolar units with identical time constants, so homogeneous time constants, and this never happens. This is just a theoretical idea, okay? Now, in the event you've got alveolar units with identical time constants, the distribution of gas is independent of the flow rate, duration, and frequency of inflation, where redistribution does not occur. In other words, your peak pressures equals your plateau pressures, or your dynamic compliance equals your static compliance. And these are the two graphs that you'll see in nuns. So we've got your top alveoli here, which has a time constant of 1 second, and your bottom alveoli here, which has a time constant of 1 second also. And you can see that with the duration of inflation, they both track the same way, so that your peak pressures and plateau pressures are the same, because there is no preferential filling of either alveoli. Both alveoli get filled the same. Now, they've given you another example where this one here is the top one, and this one here is the bottom one here. So this one here, they both have the same time constants, but the difference here is that the bottom alveoli has half the volume as the top alveoli. Okay, so this bottom alveoli here has half the volume of the top. And so they've got different pressure scales for both alveoli. And you can see that with the duration of inflation, they all end up at the same pressure because their time constants are the same. So despite having different volumes, because of their time constants, in terms of the proportion to the volume, they get filled the same. So that at almost after 3 seconds, both alveoli are nearly filled. And so if you have an inspiratory pause, there is no, because there's no pressure difference, there's no swinging of air, okay? This is unlike alveolar units with different time constants or heterogeneous. And this is that idea of heterogeneity, where we talk about the spread of time constants. And so what happens here is that when you get different time constants, the distribution of gas is now dependent on the flow rate, duration, and frequency of inflation. And these three are all related, okay? Frequency of inflation. Because for a given volume, if you decide to increase the respiratory rate, what you'll naturally do, so if you increase the respiratory rate, you actually decrease your duration of inflation because you need to get more breaths in per second. And then for a given volume, you need to deliver that quicker. So that increases your flow rate. So you can see how all these three concepts are all related. By increasing the frequency of inflation, you decrease your inspiratory time or inspiratory duration, and you have to increase your inspiratory flow rate. And so what happens is that you get preferential filling of fast alveoli, which is represented as your peak pressures. And this affects dynamic compliance. So that for a given tidal volume, increasing frequency decreases your duration or inspiratory time, which increases your flow rate. And so that you get higher peak pressures representing decreased dynamic compliance. And you can try that when you're back in theaters in a fortnight. Have someone on volume controlled ventilation and increase their frequency. So let's say you've got them on 10 reps per minute, increase it to 15, and you'll see their peak pressures go up. And the other things that you can sort of change is things like the IE ratio, which will then automatically influence your flow rate. Okay? And then you can see how changing those parameters affects your peak pressures. And all that in play has to do with all the different time constants, right? Now, this is where the concept of redistribution. So redistribution will occur if inflation is held. And this is that Pendeloof effect. And Pendeloof just means the swing of air. And we've got the swinging of air from fast to slow alveoli. And when we say fast to slow alveoli, we mean from high pressure to low pressure. And I'll show you on the next diagram here. Now, on this first example, so we've got this alveoli, which has a time constant of 1 second. In fact, let me put this in red. And then we've got the second alveoli, which has a time constant of 2 seconds. And so what this diagram is showing is that they have done a duration of inflation of 2 seconds here, okay? And at 2 seconds, both alveoli have the capacity to retain the same volume. And so this is the fast alveoli, and this is the slow alveoli. And what happens is that the fast alveoli gets filled first versus the slow. And then, so what you see is that pressure difference, okay? The pressure difference comes here. And this pressure difference represents your peak pressures. And so your peak pressures is represented by your fast alveoli. And then if you have an inspiratory pause, you get that pendulum effect from fast to slow. In other words, from high pressure to low pressure. So high pressure to low pressure. Okay. And this gives you your plateau pressures. So your plateau pressures tend to be more representative of your slow alveoli. And the conceptual thing here is that you have to give it enough time. You have to give it enough time to allow that, that pressure to equalize. And in terms of how much time you need, really depends on the heterogeneity of time constants. Because if you've got very slow alveoli that's heading, 4-5 seconds, remember what I said, you need to have 2 to 3 time constants before you get completion. In other words, when we talk about 2 to 3 time constants, if you're talking about 10 to 15 seconds. All right. Now the example below. So the example below has again 2 alveoli, and this one at the bottom is actually the fast alveoli, and it's got a much lower volume versus the top, which is the slow alveoli. Okay, and it's got a much higher volume that it can fill. And again, have a look on what they've done. They've just drawn different pressure scales because they run on different volumes. And again, you can see that the termination of inspiration is happening at 2 seconds. And at 2 seconds, remember what I said? It's the fast alveoli that gets filled up first. Okay. And so if you go across those pressures in the alveoli, that's above 0.4. And those are your peak pressures. So your peak pressures are representative of your fast alveoli. And then you've got the inspiratory pause, where you've got the movement of gas from high pressure to low pressure. So here you've got gas going from here to the slow alveoli. And so you see this, the pressure drop. So the pressure has gone from above 4 to just above 4, okay? And so your plateau pressures are representative of your slow alveoli. This is how you measure the heterogeneity of time constants, the alpha angle here. And what you'll see is that the more heterogeneity you have, the steeper your alpha angle will be, all right? So this angle increases as the heterogeneity of time constants increase. Because fast alveoli empty first and slow alveoli empty last. And you get this steep phase 3 with no plateau, seen in patients with obstructive airways disease. Now, the thing is, when does it stop? It stops when your expiratory time is 2 to 3 times the time constants of slow alveoli. And what happens is that if you don't allow that to happen, so if you don't allow that expiratory time to occur, and you have that termination of expiration, this is what happens. So you don't actually get the true alveolar O2. And this is one of the causes of the differences between arterial and end-tidal oxygen, which is one of the questions that we'll discuss next. Now, before we go and answer this question here, are there any questions about the concepts that I have described? You can SMS it to me if you wish, or you can turn off your mic and have a chat to me. Now, there's one other thing I want to point out. People often think fast alveoli is the worst kind of alveoli, okay? So a fast alveoli has low compliance and low resistance. a slow alveoli has high compliance and high resistance. What you will see is that the fast alveoli actually has a very positive attribute. It has low resistance. And the slow alveoli actually has a very positive attribute. It has high compliance. And in fact, the ideal alveoli has high compliance times low resistance. But the non-ideal alveoli has low compliance times high resistance. And I'm sure you guys have figured this out now, is that the time constant for an ideal alveoli and a non-ideal alveoli are the same. And this is why when we talk about fast and slow alveoli, we're talking about the spread, about the heterogeneity. This is the structure that I will use for this answer here. I will have a definition of a time constant, mathematical definition, and then after that, relate it to lung units. And then after that, we'll have the factors affecting time constants, which are physiological and pathological, and the effects of different time constants, and then the quantification of the heterogeneity of time constants. So these are my headings, which when you see me write, and I want you guys to write with me, what I'll do is I will set up my subheadings on half pages. So this will be top of the page, this will be the second half of the page, and I'll probably write this on a new page, and I'll write this on a new page. Okay. Now, I think one of the candidates has said that that the idea of a slow drift was from deranged physiology. And look, as I've said, I think the resource deranged physiology is an amazing resource. It is the life work of, I think, Alex Baker. And it is there as a guide. But remember that whatever I do is always referred back to the literature that I showed you from the start. So all the words that I use they should be directly from nuns. And the reason why I do that is just to avoid that confusion and just to give you clarity. Because I think what often happens with these concepts is that they get muddied by different resources out there. And I think that if you're able to stick it to sort of the core textbooks that ANSCA gets their questions from, and a lot of their questions comes directly from nuns, I think it will allow you to give that clarity of thought as well in terms of what the examiner is asking. All right, so let's get your pens ready and let's go. So I'm going to have my time constant definition. Halfway through, I'm going to have factors affecting time constants. Effect of different time constants, quantification of the heterogeneity of time constants. So time constant equals time required to reach completion if the initial rate of change were maintained in a first order system for exploration. Lung volume for a given time equals initial lung volume times Euler's constant minus time divided by compliance times resistance. Therefore, fast alveoli equals low compliance times low resistance. Slow alveoli equals high compliance times high resistance. So factors affecting time constants, physiological, pathological. I'm going to have compliance, I'm going to have resistance, compliance, have resistance, and the compliance is essentially elastic recoil, and then surface tension surfactant for the compliance, physiological, and we have airways, tissue resistance for pathological, and say decreases with pulmonary fibrosis, increases with emphysema, and this one is just increase with bronchoconstriction secondary to asthma or emphysema. What are the effects of different time constants? So 1, 2, distribution of gas is dependent on your flow rate, duration, or your IE ratio, and frequency of inflation, or your respiratory rate. Then you get preferential filling of fast alveoli, PEEP, affecting dynamic compliance, so that for a given volume, increase flow rate. Whoever is messaging me is trying to distract me from thinking about this answer. You're challenging me. Decrease in respiratory time, increase respiratory rate. And my train of thought, increasing your peak pressures, yeah, and that would decrease your dynamic compliance. Okay, and then the other thing is that you get a redistribution of gas will occur if the inflation is held with an inspiratory pause, and that would be the pendulum effect from fast to slow alveoli, in other words, P peak to P plateau, where P plateau represents static compliance. All right. So the quantification, we're going to draw the Kaplan graph. I'm going to have time, let's say 0, 2, 4, 6, and we're going to have PaCO2 in millimeters of mercury, so 20, 40, and 60. And what we're going to draw is this. And so just draw a normal one first. And what I'm going to do is with another pen, can happen here. So the alpha angle increases as the heterogeneity of time constants increases. Okay, now how much time I've got left? So I've got 7 minutes, okay, 2 minutes left. So what I'll do is on this little graph diagram here, what I can do is that I'll draw. So time, again, 0, 2, 4, 6, and I'll have pressure in terms of in centimeters of water. We'll say 10, 20, 30, and I'll have this graph like this. Peak pressures come down, and I'll just represent this as P peak, P plateau, and say this is dynamic compliance. This one is static compliance. I'll say that due to fast alveoli, and this is due to redistribution or the pendulum effect to slow alveoli. All right. And I'm pretty happy with that. So that's what 9 minutes and 20 seconds, and I reckon that's that would be my answer here. It's another 30 seconds. Go. All right, that is time. And the next question is, let me just get rid of this. We're going to talk about physiological dead space. So physiological dead space, we need to discuss the possible causes for the arterial CO2 differing from the end-tidal CO2 in an anaesthetised intubated patient on IPPV. This is the examiner's report. So the question examines a fundamental concept in general anesthesia, which trainees are faced on a daily basis. I've highlighted this in green. In order to achieve a pass mark, candidates needed to explain the most common reason for a difference between arterial and end-tidal CO2, which is the creation of alveolar dead space. It was expected that one or more causes of alveolar dead space during IPPV would be noted, as well as the mechanism linking alveolar dead space to a decreased end-tidal CO2 being mentioned. In addition, candidates should have explained one further mechanism to get a pass, resulting in a difference in either direction between arterial and end-tidal CO2. Candidates who selected a cause which allowed them to show greater depth of understanding were more likely to pass. Higher marks were awarded for additional points, which were correctly discussed. What were these additional points? Commonly selected causes include heterogeneity of alveolar time constants and their relationship to expiratory time. So remember that with slow time constants, and if you want them to expire fully, they need to be 2 to 3 times that time constant, okay? And that's what the expiratory time needs to be. Very low tidal volumes, collision broadening, overlapping of absorption spectra, and entrainment of atmospheric air into the sample line, calibration problems, and problems related to ABG sampling. Finally, additional credit was given for recognition of the normal values for arterial CO2 and end-tidal CO2 difference in a healthy individual in both the awake state and also during IPPV. So these are things that we need to avoid. A very common error was the confusing of alveolar with anatomical dead space, often in combination with conflating end-tidal CO2 with mixed expired CO2. Remember, the two are different. So mixed expired CO2 is the amount of CO2 at the end of a normal tidal volume breath, and it's measured using a Douglas bag, whereas end-tidal CO2 is the CO2 measured at the end of capnography, at the end of phase 3. Generally by misremembering or misunderstanding Bohr's law or its modification. So Bohr's law calculates a physiological dead space using mixed expired CO2. If you want to substitute end-tidal CO2 into that equation, you are going to be measuring alveolar dead space. Okay. Another frequent mistake was attempting to use Fick's law as a basis for generating a list of causes, as the high solubility of CO2 usually completely compensates for any perturbations in all the other factors identified by this law. Equally frequent was the erroneous belief that shunt can cause a significant discrepancy between arterial CO2 and end-tidal CO2. And I'll make a small comment on that. Just the, and look, shunt can cause, shunt is not traditionally thought to cause a difference between arterial and end-tidal CO2. And that's mainly due to the shape of the CO2 dissociation curve. So for a given change in content, you'll actually get very small change in the partial pressure of CO2. Now, with very large amounts of shunt, yes, I think you could expect a discrepancy between the two, but I'll show you a text in nuns which just quantifies that effect. It's not much, but this one here, I think there needs to be a bit of grace with this statement here, because I think look, in normal circumstances, most shunt, yes, no, but it just depends on the severity of the shunt, okay? Other common errors included claiming that an increased production rate of CO2 through a number of mechanisms would lead to a difference, yep, or that increasing FI CO2 does also. So what they're talking about is rebreathing, okay? Rebreathing doesn't cause a difference between arterial and end-tidal CO2. Marks were often lost through candidates' use of directional statements and listing rather than discussing causes. A number of candidates wasted time on irrelevant materials such as the transport of CO2 in the blood, while others drew multiple graphs, which they did not then use to display any understanding of the topic. Look, I don't want you to get too disheartened by what this examiner has written. I think examiners nowadays are much more constructive in the way that they provide feedback. I think this question, when was this question asked? 2003 and 2020 A3. All right. Okay, maybe I was wrong. All right, maybe they are still quite harsh with their language. I thought they've rephrased the way they give their feedback so that it's more so about what they can do better rather than what they've done incorrectly, if that makes sense. Okay. This is a summary of the exams report. What I think you need to pass, good pass. So a pass, you need to have normal values for the awake and during IPPV. You need to talk about the difference between arterial CO2 and end-tidal CO2, specifically alveolar dead space and not anatomical dead space, with an explanation of the mechanism. And then you need to talk about one of the following. So you need to talk about either alveolar time constants or low tidal volumes as potential causes of the difference. A good pass or extra marks could come from talking about measurement errors, such as collision broadening, entrapment of air in the sampling line, calibration, and ABG sampling. Do not mention this unless you're extremely confident. So don't mention shunt, don't mention increased metabolic rate, and don't mention rebreathing, as they do not cause significant difference between arterial and end-tidal CO2. This is the literature that I've used. So again, NUNS, chapter 7, chapter 9, and chapter 21. I have used West chapter 2 in ventilation, and I have used for a little bit of the measurement, chapter 41. This is just an article where I've just taken one of their diagrams, which I think illustrates it quite well. And capnography.com is a great resource to learn about the different variations of capnography. I wouldn't use it because it's very detailed, but what I would do is I've used it just to supplement the explanation of phase 4. Now, physiological dead space. So physiological dead space is defined as the fraction of tidal volume that does not participate in gas exchange, and is the sum of anatomical dead space and alveolar dead space. The normal is 0.3. So normal fraction is 0.3, which represents just anatomical dead space. So alveolar dead space is negligible in healthy, awake, supine patients. And that should give you a clue already in terms of what the arterial and end-tidal difference should be in someone who's healthy and awake. It should be 0. Okay. Now it's measured, this is physiological dead space. It's measured using the Bohr equation, or you can also measure it as the sum of anatomical and alveolar dead space. What is the Bohr equation? So the Bohr equation is a derivation of the conservation of mass. And essentially what it's describing, let me just grab my pen here. What it's describing is that the amount of CO2, okay, produced in this scenario here, so you've got tidal volume multiplied by the mixed expired CO2 equals your alveolar ventilation, which is your tidal volume minus your physiological dead space, multiplied by your alveolar CO2. And those two quantities should equal each other as per the conservation of mass. And if you go and rearrange the formula, this is where you get this up here, the Bohr equation, where the dead space divided by the tidal volume equals your alveolar CO2 minus your mixed expired. So this is not end-tidal, this is mixed. It's the mixed expired CO2 divided by alveolar CO2, where we use Enghoff's modification to determine what alveolar CO2 is. Because of CO2's solubility, and it's considered to be diffusion limited. Okay, and we'll talk about that probably next time. The partial pressures equilibrate very quickly. So you can assume in most cases that the arterial and alveolar CO2 are equal. Now, anatomical dead space is measured using Fowler's method, and it's using a single breath of 100% oxygen in a nitrogen analyzer. This is why people get confused, because the original study uses tidal volumes to measure anatomical dead space, where the midpoint here represents the transition between anatomical dead space to alveolar gas. And at this transition point here, this is what represents anatomical dead space. Okay. Remember that when we are measuring closing capacity, so this one here, it is measured using a vital capacity breath. Again, have a look at the x-axis. Okay, lung volume up to total lung capacity. This one here, it is tidal volume. So just know that two different, they are similar tests in terms of 100% oxygen with a nitrogen analyzer, but the difference is that one uses tidal volumes and one is using a vital capacity breath. This is just a summary of the chapter in nuns. So these are the factors that affect anatomical dead space. And I've just described it here because and don't include this in your answer. This is just a summary of the concepts, of the key concepts, okay? So anatomical dead space is affected by body size, age, posture, position of the neck and jaw. The lung volume, so it increases 20 mils for every 1 liter increase in lung volume, the tidal volume and respiratory rate, apparatus dead space, and drugs. And what I'll do is sometime in the future, I will think of a way to memorize this, all right? So for those who know that one of the key things that I try to do with memory is try to create stories, because that is one of the ways that we actually remember things. So if you find that you're struggling to remember a lot of the list, I will have a look at this and try to think of a way to think of a way that you can actually remember all this. Okay. Now with alveolar dead space. Alveolar dead space is defined as alveolar ventilation that does not participate in gas exchange and excludes anatomical dead space. It can be measured as physiological dead space minus anatomical dead space. So the way to do that is you measure physiological dead space using Bohr equation, where you've got mixed expired CO2 using a Douglas bag, and then you get anatomical dead space using Fowler's method, and that transition point between anatomical to alveolar gas. So that's one way to measure alveolar dead space. The other way to measure alveolar dead space is using the arterial CO2 and end-tidal CO2 difference. And in normal patients, or in normal awake patients, your end-tidal CO2 should equal your alveolar gas, right? Where the normal awake is 0 millimeters of mercury. And during IPPV, it is 2.5 to 3.7, and that figure is directly from nuns. The reference is nuns. It is chapter 31 or 41 on, I think it's, it's a chapter on anesthesia. That's where this number comes from, all right? And I've just got this graph here from that journal article, which just shows that the difference between end-tidal CO2 and arterial CO2 is because of your alveolar dead space. And we'll go through that one more time in the next couple of slides. Now, the mechanism. So what's the mechanism of how end-tidal CO2 decreases with alveolar dead space despite causing an increase in your arterial CO2? The reason is because of mixing of ideal alveolar gas with alveolar dead space gas. And this was the diagram I showed to you on the first day. So what you have is you have alveolar dead space gas here, and you've got ideal alveolar gas. Note that in the alveolar dead space gas, your PaCO2 is 0 because it does not participate in gas exchange at all right? And so what that happens is that during expiration, that comes up and mixes with your ideal alveolar gas and drops your alveolar CO2 measured, right, to 30. And that is what is seen when you measure your end-tidal CO2. And that's what produces the difference between arterial and end-tidal CO2. It is alveolar dead space. What are the causes of alveolar dead space? So these are pulmonary hypoperfusion due to low cardiac output, can also be due to excessive PEEP, posture during anesthesia. specifically in the lateral position where you're increasing ventilation in the non-dependent lung and increasing perfusion due to gravity in the dependent lung. And there is a question related to this, which we'll go through in the future. And then the fourth thing is pulmonary embolism. And the way to remember it, it's just the 4 P's. So pulmonary hypoperfusion, PEEP, posture, pulmonary embolism. Okay, those are the causes of hypoventilation from alveolar dead space. And remember that when I say hypoventilation, remember that alveolar ventilation equals, so your alveolar ventilation, equals your tidal volume minus your physiological dead space multiplied by your respiratory rate. And your physiological dead space is a component of both anatomical and alveolar. So anything that increases your alveolar, increases your physiological dead space, causes you to hypoventilate. And this is the graph that you'll see. This is the graph clinically that you'll see in theater. And what the examiner wants you to take note is that when you have a difference between end-tidal CO2 and your arterial CO2, the most common cause is alveolar dead space. Okay. But there are some other causes as well, which we'll talk about next. This is the, going back to that slide again, going back to that concept again about the heterogeneity of time constants. So what happens is that with increasing heterogeneity, your alpha angle increases, okay? And this is what I was talking about, is that if you have early termination of this expiration, so you have incomplete alveolar emptying, all right? So let's say you end it here, you will see a difference between your end-tidal and arterial CO2. But if you allow enough time for the slow alveoli to expire, that's when your arterial CO2 should equal your end-tidal CO2. All right. Now this is other bit here, this B, what they call the phase 4 upswing. So we'll leave the questions. We'll leave the questions for the end, okay? But I will get to that question. And the phase 4 terminal upswing is seen in pregnancy or obesity. But what is the mechanism of that? So the phase 4 or terminal upswing is seen in pregnant or obese patients during large tidal volumes and low frequency ventilation. In Miller's anesthesia, and this is one of the few moments where Miller's anesthesia is unfortunately incorrect. They explain that it results from the closure of lung units with relatively low PCO2 and allows for regions of higher CO2 to contribute. Only problem I have with this is when we talk about the closure of lung units, these are in the dependent airways. And your dependent airways, which collapse first, are in the bases, and they have a high CO2. So the explanation that Miller's has is not quite correct. And this is where I think that the explanation from capnography.com is actually, it makes a lot more sense. And I've actually read the article which the source has come from, and it fits in parallel with what capnography.com talks about. So even Miller's as well refers to that article as well, but I think they've just interpreted it incorrectly. So the assumption here is that there is a high metabolic rate of CO2 production. So these are in pregnant or obese patients. You're having large tidal volumes and low frequency ventilation. And so the idea is that there's continuous release of CO2 into the fast alveoli, which contribute relatively more at the end of expiration when the dependent airways have collapsed. And the way to think about this is similar to closing capacity, where when you get closure of the bases, you get evolution of gas from the apex. But the difference here is that because these patients have a high metabolic rate or CO2 production and low frequency ventilation, during that time in that fast alveoli, it continues to produce CO2. So much so that by the time the bases collapse, the amount of CO2 in the apex is actually more than what is measured in arterial CO2, which accounts for that phase 4 terminal upswing. And this is the original article. So it's for the concept of dead space with special reference to the single breath test for carbon dioxide in BJA in 1981. And what they have here is what's called, so I think they've termed it the fast alveoli, and here is the slow alveoli. And you could probably just think of this as the apex and this as the bases. The numbers here, 1, 2, and 3 represent time, okay? So 1, 2, and 3 represents time. And on your x-axis, you've got expired volume and you've got your alveolar CO2. So what you note is that with regards to expiration, as the contributions start off with, the slow alveoli make a constant contribution to your alveolar CO2. But what happens at the end is that your fast alveoli, which continue to produce CO2 because of the high metabolic rate, when you've got these airway closure in your dependent airways, this peaks up. And therefore, this starts, your fast alveoli towards the end, starts making a larger contribution, which explains that phase 4 upswing. Right. Now, just a quick comment about shunt and the arterial and tidal CO2 difference. So it is only in exceptional patients with, for example, a shunt in excess of 30% that the gradient is likely to exceed 2 millimeters of mercury. So you can even see that you need a large amount of shunt. And I can tell you, even with 2 millimeters of mercury, just think about this, even in IPPV, the normal difference is 2.5 to 3.7. So even with shunt of 30%, you're only looking at a 2 millimeter of mercury difference. Now, theoretically, if you were talking about, you know, a 50, 60, 70% shunt, yes, this would be a lot more. And that would be something that you would see probably in congenital heart disease. All right. Now, just a couple of quick slides. These are just summaries of the possible measurement errors that occur. This is not meant to be a detailed discussion. I'll leave that for another day when there is a question surrounding, you know, the measurement of CO2. But just in summary, capnography uses infrared absorption spectroscopy, where water can block the sampling line, and you can get falsely high readings with water vapor because the water condensation can actually absorb the infrared light. And saturated water vapor pressure, as it leaves the patient, decreases with ambient pressure. And that actually increases the concentration or the partial pressure of CO2 measured. So remember that when we talk about saturated water vapor pressure in the alveolar gas equation, it's corrected. And what it's saying here is that this becomes reduced because of the temperature change. And because of that, it increases the concentration or partial pressure of CO2. And the way that they do it is fixed by calibration in the way that it's measured. Okay, so calibration is important. And that could be just as simple as saying there is a calibration error associated with the measurement of CO2. Now you can get falsely high readings of CO2 with nitrous oxide. And this is because the infrared absorption spectra of nitrous is 4.5 micrometers, and CO2 is 4.3. So you can see that it's very close. Now, the way that this is fixed is with a narrow band infrared filter, all right? And that's the way that it fixes this. The other thing is that you get collision broadening in the presence of nitrous. What does that mean? This is the phenomena in which the spectral absorption peaks of a gas, carbon dioxide here, are broadened owing to the collision or proximity of molecules of another gas, which is nitrous. And this is solved with electronic compensation. What I would do here is that when I'm writing this in my answer, I would just probably use the term collision broadening. I probably wouldn't expand on this because this question is not asking about measurement of CO2. It's just asking for a brief description of possible causes of the difference. Okay. And then finally, when we talk about arterial blood gases, arterial CO2 is measured via a pH-sensitive glass or Severinghaus electrode, and then the use of temperature-corrected arterial CO2 values. So the idea of pH stat versus alpha stat. So remember that in pH stat, you're correcting your CO2 with regards to temperature. And so there is a reduction in your arterial CO2 with hypothermia and an increase in arterial CO2 with hyperthermia. So decreases with hypo, increases with hyper. And then the other possible errors are calibration errors and human errors using mixed venous instead of arterial CO2. So this is the structure of how I would structure this answer. I would have a measurement of PaCO2 and end-tidal CO2, just as a brief description, and then the normal values of awake and also during IPPV, all right? And then after that, I'll have a section, probably, I reckon a quarter of the way down, having the difference between when PaCO2 is more than end-tidal CO2. And then I would, on a new page, have this here, where I've got arterial CO2 is less than end-tidal CO2, all right? And that's how I would structure this answer. You can think of another way to do it, but yeah, from this, then I would list all these causes here, okay? So alveolar dead space, time constants, low tidal volumes, measurement error, and then this one is phase 4 and measurement error, okay? Great. So let's get going. All right, got my timer here. You guys ready? And let's go. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to have measurement here plus normal values. 3/4 of the way down, we'll say is PaCO2 is more than end-tidal CO2 causes. And I think on the next page, what I'll do is probably in the middle, I reckon I'll have PaCO2 is less than pressure end-tidal CO2 causes. And then have one alveolar dead space. 2, I'll say complete alveolar emptying due to increased heterogeneity of time constants. 3 low tidal volumes. 4 measurement errors. And then the causes here would be phase 4 and 2. Measurement errors. Okay. So PaCO2 normally measured with a 7-House electrode, entitled CO2 via an infrared absorption spectroscopy. Normal awake PaCO2 entitled CO2 difference equals 0 millimeters of mercury. With IPPV, normal equals 2.5 to 3.7 millimeters of mercury. And because it's such unique numbers, I will reference it to say it's from nuns. Okay. Now, causes of alveolar dead space. So pulmonary hypoperfusion, PEEP, posture, pulmonary embolism, and the mechanism is alveolar dead space gas mixes with ideal alveolar gas, causing dilution of PaCO2 and ultimately PETCO2. Also increases arterial CO2 due to inadequate ventilation. Okay, good. So pulmonary hypoperfusion, say, increases zone 1, excessive PEEP increases zone 1 in the lateral position, where you get increasing ventilation in non-dependent and increasing perfusion to dependent. With the incomplete alveolar emptying due to increased heterogeneity, seen in obstructive airways disease with steep phase 3 with no plateau on capnograph trace, where complete emptying of slow alveoli can only occur when expiratory time is more than 2 to 3 times the time constant. Okay, low tidal volumes, less than anatomical dead space, less than 150 mils, and measurement error. So that would be leaks or occlusion of sampling line, leading to decrease entitled CO2, calibration errors, temperature correction of PaCO2 using a pH stat increases with hypothermia, and human error using mixed expired CO2 instead of arterial CO2. And then with the phase 4, or what's called the terminal upswing at the end of phase 3, seen in pregnant or obese patients, and represents continuous release of CO2 into the fast alveoli apex when dependent airways bases have collapse, requires large tidal volumes and low respiratory rate for this to occur. And then measurement errors, water condensation on CO2 sensor, absorbing infrared light, and collision broadening the presence of nitrous. Okay, and I guess what I could do is, and I've still got 45 seconds left, I could just draw a capnograph trace, talk about the alpha angle, and this would be PETCO2, and this is time, and this is early termination. P, that's in millimeters of mercury, and this is in seconds. All right. And that's 10 minutes. I'm going to be honest with you, I actually struggled on that one. Not my clearest thought processes there. And as you can see on this answer here, and sorry, I may not see it clearly, but not as well sort of spaced out with the structure. And I think in retrospect, what I would do is I would probably leave a lot more space for this description of Alveolar Dead Space, and probably put the third one, which is arterial CO2 divided by end-tidal CO2 on a third page, okay? Because I just seem to have run out of room there. Woo! It's like I'm sitting the exam all over again.